The Tale of Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK, the Glumpet of Gleigh. Written by Barry Dominic Graham and Hannah Helena Graham. Narrated by Peter Baker. Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK lives in a hole, but not like a badger, a rabbit, or mole. He dwells underneath the great roots of a tree, a huge ancient oak in the forest of Gleigh. His door is disguised with thick fungi and fern. 'Tis too hard to see, to define or discern. Most Glumpets have always been rare to man's eye. Like the elf and the gnome, they are nimble and sly. He is dumpy and short, with 3 weird hairy toes. He has 3 hairy fingers, but bald up his nose. Like the giant middle finger all Glumpets possess, his giant middle toe causes endless distress. With eyes truly cocked and a bluish-green face, his hair is a mess, and his nails a disgrace. But his heart is as pure as a new life begun, and his beautiful smile is as bright as the sun. Glumpets are normally crabby and crude, are curmudgeonly wry, and sarcastically rude. But Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK, unlike the rest, is pure and polite, and is simply the best. Thoughtfully helpful and graciously kind, dear meanness nor guile ever enters his mind. He is treasured, respected, beloved, and adored, for no living creature by him is ignored. Both earthly and magical he will befriend, for all forest dwellers on him can depend. Despite being daft, somewhat simple and meek, his virtues and goodness have made him unique. Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK's parents were proud. His mother was quiet, but his father was loud, that lived in the forest for hundreds of years, without any arguments, anger, or tears. When 2 adult Glumpets are deeply in love, then the gift of a child will be sent from above. There can be only one, which explains why they're rare, and the forest of Gleigh ever homed but a pair. When time was deemed right, the Green Man had appeared, with his hair made of leaves and a bush for a beard. He told that their child would be brought very soon, on the evening of Litha's bright full honey moon. Glumpets are born under mulberry trees, on a midsummer's day, otherwise they could freeze. It's a joyous occasion, which happens but once, and this child would be special, and nobody's dunce. It has to be told that on one tragic day that both Mum and Dad Glumpets were stolen away. An ogre had found its way into their wood, on its unending quest to steal people and food. But as fortune would have it, their baby was spared, as it slept in its crib with no sound to be heard. But despite just how hard the CUMPHOBIECACKs fought, being out in the open is why they were caught. Their friends in the forest soon searched all around, till the little CUMPHOBIECACK infant was found. And as years ebbed and flowed like the tides of the sea, he would grow in their care, being happy and free. Early one morning he rose with the sun. He tidied his house, then went out for some fun. He danced with a butterfly, sang with a lark, then fished in the river until it was dark. Sauntering home by the light of the moon, while planning his supper and whistling a tune, he tripped on a Wugglepuff chasing a Schnoo, then fell with his face in a Pong-Friddle-Poo. With humour intact, being still slightly dazed, he got back on his feet, feeling somewhat amazed. A Wugglepuff sighting was rare, to be sure, but those of a Schnoo were incredibly fewer. A Wugglepuff looks like a bat and a goat, and a shrew like a toad with the face of a stoat. A pong-fiddle, though, is a hideous brute, and it looks like a pig with the head of a newt. While washing his face in a babbling brook, the pong-fiddle poo made him piddle and puke. This curious illness caused certain despair, so he sought out a healer for medical care. Falling and fumbling deep through the wood, unsteadily running as quick as he could, he finally spotted a glow in the night from a small cozy cabin with candles alight. Exhausted, he fell in a heap at the door as he called for this healer who'd healed him before. Mabel the Mystic is how she was known. She could cure any ailment of body or bone. As quick as a flash she had helped him inside, then took all appropriate steps in her stride. The tears of a mermaid and twigs from a yew could normally neutralize pong-fiddle poo. For several moments he shivered and shook, and was cured in a flash with a fart and a puke. After resting a while, drinking juniper tea, he gratefully thanked her while leaving with glee. Waving farewell as he made his way home, he decided to visit Nathaniel the gnome. In a circle of toadstools, with flowers all around, in a picturesque cottage his friend could be found. Regaling Nathaniel with what had occurred, both laughed at his story, which sounded absurd. They talked until dawn brought a sunrise divine, while sharing a bottle of buttercup wine. Finally making it back to his home, since bidding adieu to Nathaniel the gnome, Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK readied for bed, after feasting on strawberries, honey, and bread. Waking at sunset, fresh and anew, completely recovered from pong-fiddle poo, he talked to the raven perched proud on his sill, requesting a feather to use as a quill. The raven was only too pleased to comply, before flying off in the darkening sky. Then, when the twilight surrendered to night, Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK sat down to write. A letter to Lucas, his leprechaun friend, was long overdue and required to be penned. He had moved near his cousin, a lonely banshee, to a place far away from the forest of Gleigh. O'er valleys and mountains now Lucas did stay, in a home made from toadstools on top of a brae. Bright emerald moss made the grass feel like sponge, in a heavenly place quaintly called Rhynie Flunge. Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK knew in his heart that Lucas and he had been too long apart. He wrote of his plan with delighted intent. The letter then sealed and addressed to be sent. Most correspondence is carried by crows, though why this should be no one actually knows, but all is delivered efficient and fast, with service remaining as yet unsurpassed. A long weary journey was looming ahead, so Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK went back to bed. He managed to sleep until dawn's early light, and awoke feeling happy, excited and bright. He packed up a haversack filled with his needs, from clean undercrackers to sunflower seeds. Then, pausing a moment, he thought of his life, recalling how long he had yearned for a wife. A lamentable fact, which has always been true, is that feminine Glumpets are woefully few, declining in numbers with each passing year. The entire Glumpet race could so soon disappear. Thus finding a wife is against all the odds, a chance which remains in the lap of the gods. But Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK hoped to succeed, so completed his chores that his quest could proceed. His friends of the forest he told of his aim, explaining his life may be never the same, but friendship so true would remain without change. Some things may be different, but never be strange. He could see this great journey to visit his friend could serve a dual purpose and still not offend. With the sack on his back and his old mandolin, an adventure unparalleled now could begin. With a lump in his throat and a tear in his eye, he smiled at his friends as he waved them good-bye. Although he had barely been lost from their sight, they missed him already and wept through the night. Should finding a wife be a possible thing, he would need to acquire an appropriate ring. So Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK pondered and planned, trying to think who could give him a hand. He walked until dusk and decided to camp, filled a jar with some fireflies to use as a lamp. A shelter he built in a lush leafy dell, where he took off his trousers to let out the smell. Sometimes a Glumpet can give forth a pong, like Limburger cheese that's been lying too long. He could usually keep smelly odours away, providing his dollops were washed twice a day. After his supper of porridge and jam, he began to remember a fairy called Tam. A long time indeed had it been since they'd met, when Tam had been caught in a butterfly net. Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK played as a boy in the glade of a forest which brought him most joy. With frolic and fun he would fill sunlit hours, surrounded by friends and the sweet summer flowers. Whether butterfly chasing or climbing a tree, there is nowhere compared to the forest of Gleigh. A paradise perfect in every such way. For the rest of his life this is where he will stay. On the day that wee Tam was caught up in the net, he was busy creating another rosette, a magical sign fairies leave in the grass as a warning to goblins that they may not pass. Fairies can tell where all goblins will roam, and how to prevent them from nearing their home, for goblins are usually nasty and cruel. They are greedy and mean, being thieves as a rule. The magical powers which all fairies possess can evaporate goblins and not make a mess. The warning rosettes are effective indeed, as the goblins who see them run off at high speed. When Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK saw what he'd done, as he held up his butterfly net to the sun, he became overwhelmed by a terrible thought that the fairy within was enraged to be caught. Fairies are normally placid and kind, except when they feel under threat or maligned. Invoking their wrath is a serious thing, as a miserable fortune it surely will bring. Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK sighed with relief when he saw that the fairy seemed absent of grief. With careful release, being humbly contrite, he assisted the fairy's escape from its plight. It flew on his shoulder, forgiving and calm, announcing that he was a fairy called Tam, explaining his purpose and reasons in full, maintaining that fairies are kind and not cruel. To warn off a goblin is saving its life, as well as protecting the fairies from strife. Rosettes have a practical merit for all, to serve as a magic invisible wall. The incident sparked a new friendship for both when Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK swore the asked oath, a promise that never a word he'd reveal, and that all fairy secrets he'd ever conceal. No bigger than Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK's thumb, a firm fairy friend was wee Tam to become. Despite losing touch when the fairies moved on, the bond forged between them would never be gone. As he lay on the grass where he'd camped in the dell, while he aired out his trousers because of the smell, he suddenly realized a wonderful thing, that perhaps his friend Tam could procure him a ring. Night quickly passed, giving way to the dawn, as Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK woke with a yawn. He packed up his camp and set off once again, but this time to visit the new fairy glen. Being fairly aware of just where it may be, wee Tam had described a strange tree by the sea, a tree with no leafage that looked like a claw, which grew in a glen that no man ever saw. Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK knew to go west, remembering this was the way Tam had stressed. A magnetized needle, some water, and cork created a compass with natural torque. He found his direction and followed it true, over hilltop and hollow in search of a clue. Eventually stopping to have an earned rest, he spied a Pogdoblet constructing a nest. Pogdoblets are hairy with one bulging eye, but have feathery wings that allow them to fly. With a bill like a duck and a tail like a rat, they are oddly misshapen and horribly fat. Now feeling refreshed and preparing to go, he was startled and stunned as it started to snow. So he put on his jumper of wapiti wool that he'd packed just in case that it ever got cool. Wapitis live in the forest of Gleigh, exchanging their wool for some sweet nettle tea. Appearing like camels with short stumpy legs, they gobble like turkeys and lay purple eggs. By late afternoon he arrived at a marsh, and to cross it would be very risky and harsh. There were reed-covered bogs that were shrouded in mist, leaving Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK shaking his fist. While sitting in misery under the gorse, there appeared in a flash an enchanted white horse. He was shocked and amazed at this glorious sight, as the horse sprouted wings and abruptly took flight. It then flew in a circle with masterly grace, descending to land in the same exact place. At the moment it landed, the wings disappeared. It seemed not such a thing, quite so beautifully weird. With a graceful approach, then the horse bowed and knelt, as it seemed to perceive the distress being felt. So Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK picked up his sack and proceeded to carefully climb on her back. She raised to her feet, and the wings reappeared. Then she threw back her head, and on hind legs she reared. With one beat of her wings they were both in the air, quickly soaring across this bleak marsh of despair. For Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK it became clear that the fairy community knew he was near. Only they could have summoned this magical mare that was something of legend and stunningly rare. In but merely an instant the marsh had been crossed, all the snowing had stopped, and was turning to frost. With the twilight descending, a glow he could see shining forth from a glen just beyond a bare tree. Returning to earth in the heart of the glen, Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK panicked again. Despite the strange light from a source undefined, he was scared that the horse would now leave him behind. While frosty white snow sparkled under his feet, the sight he beheld made his heart skip a beat. A bejewelled and gold doorway within a bright light now proceeded to open as dusk turned to night. Although being tiny and nestled in fern, the light was so bright all was hard to discern. But then from within a small figure appeared, flying out of the door as it chuckled and cheered. Now with jubilant joy and a sigh of relief, Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK's fluster was brief. His face now aglow with a cherubic smile, he sat down with wee Tam and they talked for a while. The horse was indeed a benevolent gift, as the fairies knew well he'd be needing a lift. They can see the near future with natural ease, and can magically conjure whatever they please. Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK mentioned the ring, with hope that wee Tam could obtain him some bling, explaining that he was in search of a wife, whilst making this journey his longest in life. Without hesitation wee Tam acquiesced, and he promised the fairies would find him the best. Then flying back into his radiant hole, he returned straight away with a crystalline bowl. Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK sat there aghast, as Tam proudly offered much more than was asked, a ring beyond words of a beauty supreme, white diamonds and gold in a star-spangled dream. Now bursting with happiness, hope, and delight, Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK camped for the night. Wee Tam found a place snuggled under an elm, protected and charmed by this sweet fairy realm. Early next morning he woke with a grin, as the hair of a humpling had tickled his chin. It was looking for breakfast while waddling around, with its long pointy nose scraping over the ground. Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK chuckled with mirth at this small hairy creature's incredible girth. Like a fur-covered turnip with sad droopy eyes, it had long floppy ears that hung over its thighs. With no further delay he then packed up his camp, and was happy to find not a thing to be damp. So delighted again as he gazed at the ring, as it hung around his neck on a strong piece of string. Once bidding farewell to wee Tam and his kin, he set off again with a broad grateful grin. As he head for the mountains before Rhynie Flunge, he spotted a critter that looked like a sponge. Sauntering over to see what it was, it lunged at his leg and it opened its jaws. As it buried its teeth just beneath his left knee, he squealed in hysterics and started to pee. From out of the bushes a figure then jumped. With a swing of a shovel the varmint got thumped. As Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK rolled on the ground, he could see that a young female Glumpet he'd found. The unpleasant beast that was chewing his leg was accursedly known as a bum-noodle Clegg. It has strange tufted hair that is yellowish red, which disguises 3 eyes in the back of its head. It has 6 rows of teeth and a small scraggy tail, with a face like a ferret and skin like a whale. With its kangaroo legs hidden under its trunk, it has feet like a penguin and smells like a skunk. As Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK gathered his wits, he noticed his leg had a few missing bits, and while hugging his wound as his eyes filled with tears, the courageous girl Glumpet allayed all his fears. The wound looked much worse than it actually was, and luckily bum-noodle Cleggs have no claws. The dizzy, dazed creature then scuttled away and vanished in undergrowth over a brae. Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK stared at the girl, confused and amazed, with his mind in a whirl. He could barely believe in such fortune so good, that a Glumpet so fair could be also not rude. He asked for her name after telling her his, and she shyly replied she was called Effie Fizz. As he looked in her eyes while returning her gaze, they then knew they'd share love for the rest of their days. Effie then helped him get back on his feet, while insisting that he and her parents must meet, and without reservation he promptly concurred, with the hope they'd not think his proposal absurd. Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK gave her a hug. Then she picked up her shovel and peat that she'd dug, and while leading him home through a forest of pine, young Effie assured him that all would be fine. There in the distance was smoke from a fire, with heavenly sounds being played on a lyre, an instrument favoured by Glumpets of old, of cherry-tree wood decorated with gold. Now Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK froze up with nerves as he saw Effie's mum stacking jars of preserves. With his stomach in knots, he was farting like mad, being scared at the prospect of meeting a dad. Effie called out to the cottage beyond, excited to hear both her parents respond. Her mother approached with diminishing smiles as her father emerged, gently hugging his piles. Her mother looked cranky, suspicious, and shocked to see this strange Glumpet with eyes truly cocked. She stopped for a moment and glowered with a frown, being worried her daughter had paired with a clown. Her father drew closer as scowl turned to smile, speaking welcoming words without anger or bile. He could tell that his daughter was lucky to find such a Glumpet so rare, who was pleasant and kind. Her mother soon softened, and quickly could see that a Glumpet so meek a good husband would be. Ushered into the cottage to sit by the fire, Mr. Fizz once again played a tune on his lyre. Soon Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK told of his life, of his parents and past, and his hope for a wife. He explained that the journey to visit his friend had begotten a quest that on fate did depend. As evening wore on, it became ever clear that for Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK marriage was near. Her parents agreed that their union be blessed, and a wedding in Gleigh would most likely be best. Then Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK knew it was time, because no other moment could be so sublime. He reached in his sack for a fumble around, expecting his ring to be easily found, His mouth became dry, and his heart missed a beat, as he silently screamed, squirming there on his seat. While he frantically rummaged, 'twas then he recalled, on the string round his neck, there the ring he'd installed. Pulling the string out from under his vest, he proclaimed that this ring marked the end of his quest. Getting down on one knee, he reached out for her hand, took a big Glumpet finger, and slipped on the band. With tears in her eyes their engagement was sealed, and the fate of their lives had at last been revealed. Then with prompt celebration their union was set, and the way that they'd met both would never forget. With vital arrangements now due to be made, Effie Fizz and her parents thought not to dissuade. They insisted his journey he should not expunge, with Lucas awaiting him in Rhynie Flunge. He was sorry to leave his fiancée so soon, but decided to go by that same afternoon. After teary farewells, then his journey resumed, afraid unknown challenges still ahead loomed. As evening approached, he was well on his way, with the hope no diversions would lead him astray. Then far in the distance he saw Rhynie Flunge, sadly not the crevasse into which he would plunge. He let out a scream as he started to fall, but luckily didn't get injured at all. Then to his surprise he could hear voices call, spotting people like him who were equally small. They were locked in a cage, looking weary and sad. Then he knew in a flash that he'd found Mum and Dad. He helped them escape from the foul ogre's lair, and they hugged for an hour, being freed from despair. Relaying the details surrounding his life, his parents rejoiced that he'd found a good wife. With Lucas the leprechaun all did unite. Then they left Rhynie Flunge, heading home with delight. The following summer the wedding took place, which family and friends would profoundly embrace. The Glumpets of Gleigh would know gladness and laughter, and love every day of their lives ever after. The end. You have been listening to The Tale of Mr. CUMPHOBIECACK, the Glumpet of Gleigh. Written by Barry Dominic Graham and Hannah Helena Graham. Narrated by Peter Baker.